Hey guys, got another interesting Reddit post for you guys, so without further ado, let me start. She opens her post with, I'm a 38-year-old female. I have been married for 11 years, and about 8 months ago, my husband started coming home from work smiling, and I want to tell you exactly why that terrified me. So, me and my husband Marcus had been together since our mid-20s, and for most of our marriage, he was a good husband. Present, reliable, not the most expressive man in the world, but solid and steady, and I always felt like we were a team. And then, about 4 years ago, he went through a really dark period where he was withdrawn and snapping at small things and just generally not himself, and our relationship got strained and difficult. And there were months where we barely felt like a couple at all. We went to therapy, and it helped, and slowly things got better. And we came out of it, and I remember feeling so relieved that we had made it through. And things settled back into a quiet normal, and I told myself we were okay. And I believed it for a while. And then, about 8 months ago, something changed again. But this time, it wasn't darkness. It was the opposite. Marcus started coming home lighter, more talkative, laughing more easily. And the first few times I noticed it, I thought maybe he was just in a good spell at work or something had clicked for him, and I told myself to be grateful. But the feeling wouldn't go away because here is the thing about being married to someone for 11 years. You know them, you know the texture of their moods and the specific way they carry stress and the difference between genuine ease and performed ease. And what I was seeing in Marcus did not feel like a man who was finally at peace. It felt like a man who had somewhere else to put his happiness, and that is a completely different thing. I started paying closer attention, and the more I looked, the more small things I noticed, like he had started being more careful with his phone, not in an obvious panicked way, but in a quiet habitual way where it was always face down or in his pocket. And he had started going to the gym more, which I had encouraged for years, and he had never been interested in, and there was a new kind of distance in him that was hard to describe, because on the surface he was warmer and more present than he had been in years. But underneath that warmth, I could feel a wall that hadn't been there before. I want to say that I tried to talk to him about it, but every time I brought up that something felt different, he would smile and say he was just in a good place and ask why I couldn't just be happy for him, and I didn't have a specific answer to that. So the conversations always fizzled out, and I was left sitting with this feeling that I couldn't name and couldn't shake. And after about 3 months of this, I made a decision that I told nobody about and hired a private investigator. I know how that sounds, and I'm not going to pretend it was a comfortable thing to do. But I was living inside a feeling that was eating me alive, and I needed to know if I was losing my mind, or if my instincts were right. And I told myself that if the investigator came back with nothing, I would go back to therapy on my own, and work through my trust issues and never tell a single person what I had done. The investigator came back to me after 2 weeks and asked me to come in and sit down, and right then, I knew it wasn't nothing, and I sat across from her and she put a folder on the table, and I stared at it for a second before I opened it, and the first thing inside was a photo of Marcus sitting at an outdoor table at a coffee shop, and across from him was a woman I had never seen before, and they were leaning toward each other in the way that people do when they don't want the rest of the world to hear what they're saying. I looked at the rest of the photos, and there were several more. Different days, different locations. Always the two of them, always that same closeness, and then I got to the last section of the folder, and the investigator had included some background information on the woman, and I looked at her name, and I looked at the details, and I sat back in my chair, because I recognized who she was, not because I had ever met her, but because Marcus had mentioned her exactly once about 2 years earlier, as a colleague who had been going through a hard time at work, and he had mentioned it so casually, and moved on so quickly that I had never thought about it again until right now. I drove home and I sat in my car in the driveway for a long time, and I thought about 11 years, and the dark period and the therapy and how hard we had both worked to get back to each other. And then I thought about that wall I had been feeling underneath his warmth, and I thought, okay, I know what this is, and I went inside. But here is where this story goes somewhere I did not expect, because I did not confront Marcus that night or that week. Instead, I called the investigator back and I told her I needed one more thing, and I asked her to find out everything she could about what was actually happening between them. Not assumptions, not interpretations, actual information. And she said she would see what she could do, and 2 weeks later, she called me and asked me to come back in. And when I sat down this time, the investigator looked at me differently than she had the first time. And she said she needed to tell me something before I looked at anything, and I told her to just say it. And she told me that the woman Marcus had been meeting was a therapist, a private therapist he had been seeing on his own twice a week for the past 5 months, and that the reason the meetings looked the way they did was because they were not having coffee, they were having sessions. And he had been doing this alone, without telling me, because he had relapsed into depression 6 months ago and had been terrified of putting us through it again. I just sat there and I couldn't speak for a minute. And the investigator quietly slid a box of tissues across the table, and I didn't even realize until that moment that I was crying. And I drove home, and Marcus was in the kitchen, and I walked in and I just said, "I know about the therapist." And the look on his face was not guilt. It was relief and shame at the same time. And he just said, "I didn't want to scare you." And I said, "You scared me more by hiding it." And we stood in that kitchen and we both cried for a long time. We are still together, and we are both in therapy now, separately and together. And Marcus told me everything about the last 6 months, and I told him everything about the private investigator, and we just laid it all out on the table. Every fear, every instinct, every decision we had both made in the dark, trying to protect each other. And it was the most honest conversation we had ever had in 11 years of marriage. She ends her post with this: "I hired a private investigator because I was certain my husband was hiding something. And I was right. I just had no idea that what he was hiding was how much he was hurting." And I think about that a lot. That ending lands differently than almost any story I have read, because the whole time you were reading it, your brain is going in one direction, and then it just quietly turns and takes you somewhere completely unexpected. And it isn't a betrayal story at the end of it. It is a story about two people who love each other so much that they were both silently breaking themselves, trying not to hurt the other one. And if that doesn't make you feel something, then I don't know what will. Drop it in the comments if this one hit you. I read every single one, and I'll see you in the next one.